It's Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board, and this is the Prairie Monk Show, and this is October the 2nd, I believe, and this is our weekly chance to talk to you about what's happening in the community, especially things of an environmental nature, and it often veers off into a few other things, and it looks like we'll be talking about Australia, perhaps, for a little while today.
So, went to the farmer's market. I always enjoy going to the farmer's market. I meet people there. I do a little politicking about the rail trail to Danville, how it might be connected to Decatur, and I find people coming in from those two quite different districts. And I gather up some food, and I often support people who have food that might be a little bit damaged or not quite so perfect, and I think that amounts to a lot of food in this country that sometimes gets wasted. And at the same time, inside the Lincoln Mall, there was a Maker Fest, and sponsored by independent media and a whole bunch of others, and I found it very interesting. It was heavily computerized. There were people that were doing sewing using computerized machines. There was 3D, the creation of images that are in 3D dimension in plastic. There were people who were straight artists that did not have that computer base. There were people who were silk screening. Ed Wisekamp was there, and he was teaching a lot of young people. He and others. The festival was rather well announced, and lots of children and their parents, and they were all involved in different things. And so there was someone with wishbones, who was recycling chicken wishbones. There were people who had handheld music synthesizers, simple but straightforward, and you could almost create your own orchestra with this little handheld instrument. Very different from the Moog synthesizer, which years ago would have occupied the most of a whole building, and not done nearly as much as these little synthesizers. There were drones. There were drones flying around. Drones are getting smaller and smaller. And I used to work with someone who was developing drones, and it was about 2 feet long and like a small plane, toy plane. But they've gotten very small and computerized and with cameras on them. It was interesting that Bill Saylor, whom I have to say thank you to for filling in last week, he came with an article about where John Dixon from the News Gazette went to record a movement of 2 Amish houses to Centerville for an Amish museum. And he had taken a drone, and it was rather impressive to have Amish people who tend to do things in a simplistic way, but not really that simplistic. They're very good business people, and they just have an adherence to a certain age, and to have people who plow with horses or ride in buggies, to see a drone rising up and over a house that's being delivered for a Amish museum was quite interesting. So we had music, we had regular painting, and people who just were enjoying that. There were puppetries, there was clothing, there was African art, there was miniaturization. I had to ask whether the miniature artifacts could fit into bonsai events, but no, the miniatures were of characters that are computerized characters that I was not familiar with. There was a creative anachronism which goes back to the 17th century and tries to simulate activities of that era. And if you haven't been to a creative anachronism event, you know that these people come sometimes with horses, sometimes on foot, and they have simulated warfare, and all dressed in clothing that they've created themselves with the techniques that were used in the 17th century. And there are a set of those people in Champaign, but it's quite fun to go to quite a large event with perhaps hundreds of people involved. There was rocketry. I didn't work with rocketry very much, but I enjoyed talking to these people. And one of the questions that I have is how does this sort of specialty fit in with the concept of sustainability and biological things? Is this an enclave where you become very much a musician or a puppet person, or how does this interface with a broader interest? How do we, for instance, perhaps just use some of these techniques to do database, or to have people get access to nature? I don't know. So we talked about that some, but I also went over to the cinema gallery, where last week Bill had been to the gallery to see Dennis Rowan's things. And Dennis Rowan has retired as a art professor. His technique is to have very traditional image along with a lizard or a snake or a what have you, and that is sometimes tests your mind if you collage older and newer things. And some of the things that he does is take some of the copper plates that he made in years past and carve them up and include the metal and the image in the picture, and then create another plate or another wall hanging. So he has perhaps 50 images in a cinema gallery, and I think that's well worth your while to go see them. Then I headed to St. Joe. Last week we had talked about hydrology, and we'd talked about the cutting off of a meander curve, so that the rivers were channelized to let water get off the land so that we could do agriculture. But that leaves you thinking about the hydrology and the stream that meanders horizontally, but also meanders vertically, so that you have riffles and low spots and the sorting out of creatures according to that sort of situation. Riffles, for instance, will have a bunch of netters that catch bacteria and the like as it come over a small waterfall that you would even hardly recognize as a waterfall, but still it brings in food for different creatures. Whereas if you were in a backwater, for me being Australian, that's where I would look for a platypus or creatures that here, like a beaver, that would use a dam at the riffle end and then use the other area to make a housing and have an entrance below the water level and crawl up into a habitat. So I went back there mainly to take a photograph of the recently installed bridge over a bridge. You have a railroad bridge, it's a very strong steel bridge, and a steel bridge on top of that, put in pieces. It will allow bicycles in the future. But the News Gazette has reported recently that Dan Olson, from the director of the Forest Preserve District, is concerned that four-wheelers look at the trail that is being developed through St. Joe, and it looks like it's completed, but what happens is you put down a heavy layer of underpinning. Well, in this case, they've put down a layer of material that's sort of road pack that is a cover for the possibility that there might be creosote in the soil that was in the creosote would have been in the preservation of the ties. The next layer is a little crushed limestone, larger than smaller and smaller, and it looks like this could be ridden with a bicycle or driven with a four-wheeler. And so Dan is pleading that, and the construction people, cross construction, are pleading that please do not get onto that trail and screw it up before it has been formally established. And it's lucky that so far no four-wheelers have really screwed it up, but there's a possibility that they might do so, and that's very deleterious to a rather expensive trail. They're saying that the trail is almost finished in a way, but it will still be, they'll still be working on it into the next year's construction season. So they're anticipating that this trail will not be open till June or July in the 2017. So watch it. There was a bike ride recently that created a funding. I was at the farmer's market and I said thank you to Sleepy Hollow people that have a winery near to Danville, but they have held fundraising events. I keep encountering people who are doing different work with this railroad bed. So watch it and watch it from a distance, and realize we're also wanting to restore the prairie on either side of the ballast, and that has its connotations. I wrote to the Forest Preserve. I wanted to remind them that this is a picking season. This has been a very good prairie season, and if you pick seed now, there are sometimes the fear. Schools do this quite a bit. Their students come back in September, and you get a September prairie. So when you're planting, be careful not to plant too many grasses so they don't dominate and prevent broadleaf plants from coming up and expressing themselves. And also to leave room for the hyacinths that might come in spring, or starry-eyed grass, or other plants that come at a different season of the year. And also to remember that the prairie will change as you reconstruct it. The things like New England aster will be very showy early on. It likes soft soil, but then it peters out some because as the soil hardens with rain and with maturity, then the soil gets harder and the plants are there, but they're not as numerous. So as you collect seed, think about how it gets planted. Do you plant it in patchiness? If it was a native prairie, you would have plants sorting themselves out according to the moisture gradient. You might have cordgrass around a creek, but when a very dry hill with loose, dried up silt that's blown across the country from the waterways like the Mississippi and the Illinois River and deposited on top of glacial till. That's very dry. If it's wet, it's very sloppy. If it's dry, it's very hard. So the plants that grow there are different. And so if there's a temptation to sometimes put all your seed together and sow it as an overall prairie, but that's not exactly how prairies work. If you have a soil map and you know that the soils are different in different places, then you might just scatter some seed by hand, and you might need a little bit more seed if you're planting by hand, because a pasture drill that you use to plant the seed with will make a little furrow when the seed puts in it, and then there's a tamping wheel that covers that seed over. So that seed has a much more surety to grow than if you just dipsy-doodle seed from your hands. So most people who are planting prairies know this already, but I wanted to remind the Forest Preserves that is there. We're still hoping to collect some ties and steel from the area that's being worked on, and that we also discuss. We've got to be very careful that if we get ties, that we just don't put them in a heap and have them stolen. It's a real problem, and it's the same problem with railroad steel. If you leave it around for more than 2 minutes, it disappears. So we have to be careful to get the people who are giving us permission to lift that sort of material, to give us permission soon enough to allow us to capture it before it may disappear. While we're at this sort of thing, I might mention that one of the things we have to watch is that an invasive species. So on Monday this week, with Ron Sleater helping, he's very much into this, we will be taking out autumn olives in the area between Monticello and Cisco, about where Wildcat Creek is. There are a lot of prairie plants underneath. We've taken out the major trees that are growing there, but there's 1 million seeds still in the pool of seeds that are in the soil, and so young plants come up. So we have to be constantly getting rid of the invasive plants that shade out the prairie and deny it from coming to express itself. And so help me, as soon as we take out those trees, the prairie plants come back. And So on Monday we'll be doing that. So
If people wanted to help you, I'm guessing the easiest way would be for them to meet you here.
Yes.
Even if they were going to drive there themselves, you could lead the caravan out
Yes.
to where the trees and all
we'll be
that.
going out there. I'll leave here about 11 o'clock. And so this is at next door to Weft. It's and my phone number is 840-1911 or 351-1911. 840-1911 will get me on my cell phone. And we would go out. It's not an awfully convenient time of day for most volunteers, but it's there, and we'll be working at it, and we'll take out plants and put a little piece of herbicide on the stems to make sure that they don't come back. It'll be spot herbiciding, not blanket herbiciding, which sometimes goes on under the easements like power lines. Okay, this is WEFT, and that's sort of what I was doing just the last few days. So we want to remind you that this is the Prairie Monk. I take advantage of my surname, which is Monk, to be the Prairie Monk. And we have items up on YouTube that are disjunct in a way, but they get together. And eventually you get an idea of what we do with prairie preservation especially, and environmental issues. I have been toying with the idea of recording some of the things we do in a more formal fashion. And that's not always easy, but I've gone back to reading a book about this, about Australia, and it's written by a woman who was a middle child in a family of 5 girls and 1 boy, and they grew up in the hinterlands of Queensland. And I'm looking at her writing. She was fortunate to eventually go to the University of Brisbane or University of Queensland at Brisbane, and became a writer. And she married a diplomat and came to America. So she's long since passed now, but it is interesting that her story is very compelling, and it's almost the sort of thing that I would like to see put into a movie to allow people to understand the bridging of several generations. She was from a reasonably sophisticated family, not really well-heeled, but came north with relatives and friends from places like Sydney. There was an attraction. There was several generations here. There was the generation of her uncles and her grandparents who came north to Queensland, and so you have to think about, if you write, for instance, a book. She is writing a book, but it probably took her 10 years to write, and you may not have that sort of time. But just to jot down the things that happened to your family, the things that happened around the politics of settlement, the invasion of the rainforest and things like that, is interesting, and just a few notes left with your relatives, or left with the public library, or left with both. And you don't have to be worried about how crude it is. David knows well that I write often in a very chain of consciousness, and so the words aren't spelt properly. the lines are, the headings are not there, I'll get confused and make one what you might call a chapter more dominant than another, and then you have to go back and balance it out. And I'm not very well researched, so I have to go back and research. Well, Joan Colebrook did just that, and she gave you an idea of her life. And I think it's a good example of what people like myself might be responsible for doing. She was in Queensland on the plain that was above the geology of Australia, which has an east coast. This was Gondwana land, and this was a huge area that was floating around the world, and it had a connection through to Singapore and Malaysia and those places. And early Aboriginals were there, and this continent, when the world's climate changed and the water rose and cut off that estuary, then you're left with a continent that was isolated with kangaroos and koalas and all sorts of animals and plants that are specific to that country. So the first chapter in this, if I was doing an imaginary book, would probably have to be about the geology. It's the same way as it is here. We talk about the moraines and the outwash plains and how Flatville was settled on an outwash plain, how early settlement was probably on the moraine because it was well drained, and actually trees could grow there because they weren't waterlogged. So the geology is probably important, and then you want to know who were the native occupants. Were there many tribes? Were there few tribes? How did they interact? In this case, some of the early tribes were cannibalistic, and so you could end up in trussed up in a cooking oven, which is buried out of the ground, and with rocks and fire, and you just might end up being eaten. But that also applied to Aboriginals with challenges from other Aboriginal tribes. And it got worse when settlers came because they brought guns. And so whereas the Aboriginals were using spears, they now could use guns in their own battles and also in battles with invading settlers, immigrants who were taking down things like the rainforest, which is the home of the Aboriginals. So at first the Aboriginals were very generous and helped survive convicts that went to Australia that couldn't go to the US anymore because there had been disembowelment from the Queen and Kings of England. And so early settlement was by convicts and the administrators of convicts, and they didn't quite know that Australia was rather poor soil, not like the US, which is very rich soils from glaciation. Their soils are often been waterlogged under the sea and leached and then uplifted, but they're not very good for growing vegetables or animals, and so the Aboriginals had to teach the early settlers in Australia how to survive. Some of them didn't survive, some of them did survive, some of them survived and then turned around and exterminated the Aboriginals, because the Aboriginals tended not have fences around their land. You didn't own land. You used it, and you used it carefully. So it was a little bit like walking into an Indian establishment in the U.S. There was not the philosophy of individuals owning land, and so the Aboriginals and the Indians would walk across people's land as if it was also theirs and do things that settlers didn't like, and so you had the challenges. So you're doing the geology, but then you're doing the early history of the sociology, and then you have. Let me look at my notes here. You still have allegiance to the king and queen and their establishment. And you have to know that some of the convicts that you have in Australia are from a setup in the European countries where dukes and earls decided that they needed property, and so often exterminated the peasants, who then had to. So they evolved big territories that were their castle on the hill, more or less, and the peasants had to find their way into cities where they had no food, no living quarters, often had to steal and do strange things in order to survive. So then you could be hung or burned at the stake, or you could be transported to the colonies of, say, the British Empire. It was also Dutch, Spanish, German, Italian colonies, and so those colonial people that were given transportation rather than a death sentence were actually very lucky, because they would be banned from Europe perhaps for 7 years or for life. And when they arrived, there was probably no chance that they would ever go home. They would come by sailing ship after Captain Cook and others discovered places like Port Jackson and places where early settlers could be. And those small colonies tried to expand. And you go back to the geology, because there was this huge uplift of the Gondwana land, so that you had a coastal plain, and then you had an uplifted mountain, not very high, 2,000 feet, some places 7,000 feet in other places, but enough to make it very awkward for settlers to escape from colonial situation or actually be innovative. If you were going to run into those mountains, you ran into canyons, and you couldn't get up and over the plateau that was on the top of the mountain. If you climbed up on top of the mountain, you found it very hard to find your way across that plateau. So once again, we're looking at geology, and you're looking at slopes going west. Whether it's in New South Wales or Queensland or in Victoria, these are the states that were established in Australia. The first settlers were looking for resources. Some of those resources were gold, silver, tin, so there was a mining effort. And you only could get to where you were going by often following the streams. So you could boat from the ocean end and gradually go to canoes and get up into. And it was the same here. Many of our early settlements were up the rivers or down the rivers, and so these were people who faced losing their lives. They had to be creative. They had to face starvation, but they had a twinkle in their eye, and they were often male. But then they would have the women come, and the women were kind of different from what they were in England. This was, you couldn't possibly retain all your traditional religion, your customs, because you were going to have to survive. If you're going to have 6 children in Queensland and survive, you're first of all going to have a house. The first house might be a bunch of tin and wood, and you would sleep on sack benches, or the floor would be clay. You'd sweep with a broom you made out of tree leaves. You tended to survive, and even childbirth would not be easy because you didn't have any chance to have doctors or hospitals. So early settlements went up over that barrier. It was called the hill or the ridge or the bump. And on top of that, there were volcanoes, because when you bump the earth, the magma comes up in various places. So all down the coast, from Queensland, from New Guinea down to Victoria, and even into Tasmania, you get that sort of geological thrust, which allows for little fertile basaltic areas that are rich. So there's a temptation to go up onto those sites and take out the rainforests in a rather cruel fashion and turn it into pastures for cattle, and take out a few of the trees that could be used for making ships, for making coaches, for trains, or to making buildings. But not a lot of it. Basically, you felled the trees and burned the results and took out the stumps and plowed the ground, and that was a challenge. And the generation before didn't get to plow; they got to do mining, and then they got to have smelters, so that you didn't have to send to the cities a boatload of raw minerals. You could reduce the load with a smelter, and so that was an entrepreneurial operation, and you had the next step was to take some of that rainforest that you were destroying and have sawmills, and so you would send a partially formed wood timber to the coast, and then you have to think about transportation. The transportation was by coastal steamer. And the coast of New South Wales is not a very friendly coast, so you had to have reasonably good coastal shipping. They were wooden ships, but then they were built on the rivers that came out of these rainforests. And I can remember in my generation, we still had boat builders on the Bellinger River where I grew up. And so when Joan Collinbrook is talking about Queensland and talking about the Cape to the north and the Torres Strait, then she's talking about her grandparents, but she's also talking about her generation, which was a generation older than I am. So the bullock teams that she was talking about, at one stage they had 50 oxen drawing the mullock that would have silver in it or tin in it, because they were working with sticky soils and monsoon rainfall, and the monsoons came and it was very wet. So you didn't wear shoes. I grew up without shoes because we were on the southern edge of the monsoonal area, and to wear shoes was to always be taking them off and drying them. You just learned to have bare feet with a half-inch sole, and you did very well at that. But you got wet, you got your clothes dried on you, and you just didn't worry about that. If you were working with cattle, you took a potato sack and put it over your head, and then the water would run down your nose, and you'd blow it off. You got used to doing that. So these things that Colbrook would report are the things that I grew up with. Some there were people in my neck of the woods that would have slab houses and dirt floors. Not a lot, but they were there. I grew up with bullock teams. They weren't 50 bullocks long, but they were shorter, and they lugged timber out of the forest. Unlike the clear-cutting of rainforests, the people of my era retained the rainforest some by having pulleys, and they would take oxen that are able to, they're cloven hoofed, and they can climb on mountainsides, and you would drag a tree out by the aid of pulleys that let you pull a tree around another tree without tearing it down. These days you go in with a bulldozer and you tear down and replant and hope that the replantation will be proper evergreens that grow fast, and you can do that. But when you take out that rainforest, you're taking out the biodiversity, which is tremendously wonderful. So Colbrook talks to you about the birds and the bees that she grew up with, and that the family grew up with. And she talks about the building of a better house, more or less a log cabin house. She talks about the family growing up, and how mother would have to be dependent on the elder children to look after the younger ones. So in her generation that happened, but in my father's generation, he was the 14th child. So he was brought up by his elder sister, and you still had the elements of the colonies, the empire, the religion. The religion was basically Anglican. The Church of England was the state religion. There were Catholics there. There was perhaps 4/5 Protestant and 1/5 Catholic, and the Catholics were very different, and so you had a slight tension between the two. In fact, even to today, the Catholics are referred to as, and she wrote, the mix. And if you go to Australia today, you can get that sort of tension still. But on the other hand, you're all settlers, and you all have to work together, and you all have to protect each other and work with each other. And then how do you recreate? Do you work like crazy, then go to the local pub and drink and play music? And what music do you play? You play the music that comes from the inner suburbs of London and Manchester and Liverpool and Newcastle, and you adapt them for your own situation so that the lyrics change. And you waddle out of there, perhaps drunk, and so how do you then survive? It's and there are elements of that comes through from generation to generation. Let me have a look at my notes. I was thinking about this sort of stuff. Death was a problem. The son for the Colebrook family was a younger person, and when it started World War II, they needed trees for the making of ships, and so he was a forester by nature. He'd been to a agricultural college. He was in charge of groups that would go into the rainforest and sort out trees. And when you do that, you bring those trees in, whether it's with oxen or by old-style tractors. You put them on a platform. The platform usually is high enough at the front end for you to load a timber jinker. A timber jinker is a set of wheels set behind a truck or a bullock train where you roll 2 or 3 logs onto it. So you have to have a place to load that log. If it's 3 feet across, it's a heavy log, and it's going to drop onto that jinker. And so you store those logs until you get to transport them to the coast or later to the railroads. Those logs have to be chalked so that they don't roll. If you have 10 very heavy trees on top of each other, then it's very risky. They will roll, and that happened. That happened to Tracy, the son, and he realized what was happening and quickly ran away. But he caught his foot in a liana vine, and the logs rolled over him, so he was instantly killed. That sort of thing is not unusual. To have access to remove trees is another problem. To know that if you're going to fall a tree, you sometimes have to climb up past the buttress roots and put chocks into the tree so that you can put a platform so that you can climb up to a certain level and cut the tree. And you have to know to fall it in one way, so you put a cut on one side that is lower than the other side, and it eventually, with your own cleverness, you can fold it so that you don't screw up other trees. Just reporting on these little things are the sorts of things that you can do with your lives and your experiences. And it doesn't have to be writing, it doesn't have to be a book. Sometimes it is drawing and sculpting. I'm aware that Glenn Martin here has a father who was head of the sculpture department, but he grew up in a log cabin home in west of the Colorado, and he and his brother got used to drawing, and so he became a sculptor. So you leave your story that way. He passed on, and Glenn has put together that story and sculpted pieces. So what you leave, even if it's in a chain of consonants, a type of record, is very helpful. Photographs. And please don't leave your photographs in the attic or in the basement. The basement is usually damp, especially in the Midwest. The attic is usually very hot. So you need to find a place, a spot in your house that is more mild-mannered, and perhaps to leave some things to archives. Wow, we're getting almost finished here. So we've got a few minutes left. What did I miss out on? I was trying to encourage you to think about this for your own life and leave it for your friends, your family, and some of this involves the children that we were working with at the festival the other day to let people know what was. And I really think that the Joan Colebrook book would be the basis for a film that would deal with this sort of settlement of the Australian continent on the east coast, with all its rainfall and its mining and the rainforests being destroyed and the agriculture, and gradually the trains climbing up the hill with a zigzag so that they would climb up a certain amount, and then they'd have a run up and they'd push it up to the next piece, and then a run up, and then they'd push it up to the next piece. So eventually they get over the range and up to the plateau. In this case, it was the Atherton Plateau. And then you drop down the other side, the gentle slopes, and that was not easy either. So you had to drive your sheep to the top so that they could be then put on the train. Or you had to drive them right across in the early days, right across the plateau and down the other side, because the coastal plain and the mountain were so different. Not too high, but very awkward to get over. So, okay. I think you also need to know that there are libraries around, like the Urbana Free Library, that do a lot to collect information in this region. And so I encourage you to check that out. So I think this is enough for now. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And let's get a little music going here. Why don't we? There we go. Couple of points to make for folks. Dave mentioned earlier that episodes of this you can actually watch on YouTube. He mentioned that it's kind of catch as catch can. It can be kind of, wild. The interesting thing about the internet is, while that's true, I mean, the internet as a whole, and for example, Dave's shows on YouTube can be really diverse. And if you went through them one after the other, they'd be very different from week to week. If you go through and search, you can actually find specifically what you're looking for. If you want to know about the Kickapoo Trail, you can type that in at YouTube and it will point you directly to the episodes, because we've actually put information up there telling you this one is about the Kickapoo Trail. He mentioned toward the end there Glen Martin. If you go in and you type in the name Glen Martin and then in quotes the Prairie Monk, it will quite possibly take you to the episode where we talked about Glen Martin and such like.